want to continue the themes that we were dealing with in the previous seminar, in part by benefiting considerably from the informal conversation with participants in the brief intermission, and then moving forward. So the discussion in the intermission persuaded me that, contrary to my initial thoughts, we have not resolved each and every aspect of the issue of race discrimination. Let me note one short thread that the discussion took, and then with you move over into the issue of gender discrimination and see where we think there are useful comparisons and perhaps where we think there are useful differences. In response to a question, I invoked the notion of public libraries, and I give you again the setting of a community that maintains 7 or 8 branch libraries that faces, as is realistically true, dreadful economic distress, has to close at least one of the libraries and has to decide which one to do it. So I would think that if the library committee met and said, X library serves a predominantly black neighborhood, the hell with those people, that would not only be illegal, it would be profoundly morally offensive. The use of their race to their detriment and the detriment of their children, it seems to me, is unacceptable ethically on any kind of notions that equality is a reasonable goal. Well, suppose they didn't do that. Suppose they picked what we called in the earlier sessions together a content-neutral or procedural response. That is, they would, for example, say, we'll do what any prudent person would do. We'll go to the one that is least used or least utilized, and we will close that one down. So if someone says that to us, given the realities of race relations in America, we want at least to be careful about where the data came from. If someone says X public library is the one that is used least, we would need to know if in fact that is true. But we ought to be able to set up, as bright and fair-minded people, a procedure for getting information as to how well that particular library was used vis-a-vis all of the other libraries. And if we hired fair and honorable people to sit with the records of the library for the preceding year and count up how many periodicals had circulated and how many books and so on, and sit at the door with a clicker and see how many persons had come in, we would be able to get, I think, with fair agreement, if the procedures, the way of doing the counting was done fairly, we might be able to come to a conclusion that one of the libraries had a circulation rate significantly less than others of the library, and maybe we counted the kids in the reading room and did the same thing there. That would make us very happy procedurally as good liberals whose values in this context have to do with autonomy. No one child should be punished because he happens to have black parents, and he should have a fair and equal access to the library as much as my child who does not have black parents or whomever. But it didn't stand up to discussion because the measuring usage is not the only way to think about the libraries. One might think, as was suggested by a member of the group, that the library is more needed in an area where it is underutilized. And there we had in mind things like the children from that community don't perhaps have private bedrooms in which they can do their homework, or don't have desks at which they can do their homework, or don't have someone that they can ask to assist them with their homework, whereas if there's a smart study hall set up in a library, those kids may in fact be able to move on academically more than would otherwise be expected. It looks neutral, fair, procedural, and impartial to say we do it by usage. If I have 4, you know what usage means. And that ain't the case. It may be that certain values are enhanced by relying on usage. Other values would be enhanced by trying to measure the need. As, for example, does the child have anywhere else to study? Does the kid hang out with supportive kids who are thinking about going to college or doing their homework to do well in high school? You can develop the point. That could leave one a little bit suspicious. We have spoken at great length in earlier seminars together about the problem of relativity, about the problem of whose values, when in doubt, do the right thing. When closing libraries, do the right thing. Ho, ho, and another ho. Think it is now Sunday. Think back to Saturday late at night, early this morning. Be prepared to write on a piece of paper exactly what you did at 2 o'clock this morning. It's a sucker question, which I can use about 1 week a year. Which 2 o'clock this morning? We changed the clocks to daylight savings last night. What time is it really? Now. Is it really anything? You're off by an hour. Is it really? There may be good and efficient reasons having to do with children getting up in the morning and going to school, or farmers, or whatever the reasons used to be for creating daylight savings and not creating daylight savings. It isn't really any time, is it? But of course we function. And if I'm paying you a lot of money to drive me to the airport, yeah, it really, but it isn't really. It's just positively the language that we used earlier in this session about positive law versus natural law or higher law or value-laden law. We've made a shift. We've imposed a value, and the people who don't want to stay. Same story vis-a-vis the libraries. Same story now, and this is a question. Same story with distinctions based on gender, he asked questioningly. So the thing to write down on your notes in front of you are the letters B, F, O, Q. Bona fide occupational qualification. All men are created equal. All persons are created equal. In some respects, that is obviously absurd. It is not the case that there are no differences between blacks, whites, and Asians. There are differences in skin color between blacks, whites, and Asians. It is not the case that there are no differences between men and women. There are differences between men and women, and we can list them, or some of them, which would be non-controversial as to be differences. The question is, what ethical / social / normative distinctions, if any, what, if any, differences matter for matters of public policy, and indeed for the way we live our own lives? It is the case that black persons have darker skin than I do. Does that mean anything? Ought it mean anything in an ethically decent discussion of public policy? It is the case that women carry babies to term and I don't. Does that, if that is true, does that matter, and if so, how and why? How is it relevant to? It is also the case that some of you are left-handed and some of you are right-handed. I don't mean to offend you. Doesn't rise to the level of suffering in our society of some other kinds of groups that we're talking about this afternoon. The issue is not whether there are differences or not. The question I think is, or a question I think is, which differences ought to be permitted to influence policy choices, and I could go even further than that. Which differences ought be eliminated, or ought an effort be made to eliminate, if any? The present status of civil rights law has something to do with the Constitution, discussed in an earlier session, and something to do with various statutes of the Congress, which change from time to time. And at least in some of those statutes dealing with gender, there is a notion of a bona fide, I think that means cricket or kosher or legit, a bona fide occupational qualification. That can be descriptive. That is, one could study ancient Rome, not me. One could study ancient Rome and ask, what roles did women play in ancient Rome different from roles that women play in modern Washington, D.C.? Descriptively. That is not our concern here, though some of you may find that of interest. Our concern here much more is normatively what roles, if any, are appropriately discussed in terms of race, and why and how, and what roles now, if any, are appropriately, ethically, normatively discussed in terms of gender, and how ought that to go. It is possible to giggle about a lot of things like co-ed bathrooms at Brown University, which I think have since been eliminated. Those are not the interesting and the important questions. There are lots of interesting and important questions. Before we get to some specific cases to think about, what to do, as discussed earlier, where there are in our society some views about race which are held consistently roughly across the society, and some views which are not held consistently across the society. So much more so, I don't know empirically, with respect to gender. That is to say, even if we as a group, and let us say we were the Congress, that's not meant to insult either the Congress or us, but if we were in a position to make social policy, and if we had senses as to where gender ought to play out in a certain way or ought not be applicable, and if some number of people disagreed with us, is it then our place to attempt to educate them, to change them, to compel them to consider what we consider to be the right way, and then why ought that be so? All right. Let's talk about some specific hypothetical cases and draw out of them perhaps principles which may allow discussion among ourselves later and the normative discussions. 1. Stoll, Hinder, and Delay is the leading law firm in town. If that's literally true in your town, and any resemblance to the real world is purely real. Stoll, Hinder, and Delay is the leading law firm in town. It has never hired a female attorney. On the basis of reputed customer preference or client preference, it is not willing to hire white attorneys, quite regardless of what their abilities may or may not be, to handle commercial matters for clients on the assumption that clients will not trust women to deal with commercial matters. The law firm is willing to hire women to do family law, divorce law, and adoptions for female clients as the need may arise. Purely hypothetical, unrelated to anything anybody ever saw in the real world. Should they be allowed to do that or not? Everybody votes yes or no. First cut, straw poll. How many think it's up to the law firm? They can do whatever they want. Vote yes. Seeing none. Camera's on me, not on you. How many... one free thinker in the group. That's good. And how many would vote no? Seeing 4. And the other people have lost the use of their arms because everybody else wants to vote no? Does any sense at all that this law firm is a purely private enterprise and that's up to them to do whatever they want? Leading law firm in town, does that matter? Should whatever you come up with matter more in the leading law firm, or the leading, let's say, 10 law firms in town, rather than in the a fly-by-night law firm that isn't making a lot of money anyway and who cares? Is it that we don't want to allow this to be done because it is unacceptable behavior, like assault is unacceptable behavior? We just don't allow that in our society. People cannot hit you with a baseball bat. We don't permit it. If it happens, we try to catch the people and punish them. Maybe saying to a female attorney, you're not welcome here, is like that. It should be part of our policy that we don't let employers say to potential candidates, by the way, your gender precludes you from, what's the word I need, plastic ceiling? Is now, oh, it's going to be converted into plastic as soon as the safety folks get their hands on it. Thank you for the correction. Maybe not letting a woman work for our business, whatever the form of the business is like allowing someone to hit her with a baseball bat because she ought to be treated as an individual. Any sympathy whatsoever, question mark, for the people who come to that firm with their business and say, look, the whole world is free to do whatever it wants to do. We're very old-fashioned people here. We don't want to deal with women attorneys, and we are your clients. On our case, please guarantee that we will only have guys. Not in the real world of business can you get away with that. Should one decently think in terms like that? All right. Public versus private, you could get into issues like, does it matter how much of an impact does this firm have on the society in general, on the society of our particular small town USA? Would that matter? Would that not matter? Public, private, reputed customer, well, that's easy procedurally to get rid of. Reputed consumer preferences, and let them prove it. So, a second kind of a case. A group of female graduates of the Stanford Law School, this is hypothetical, but there is a Stanford Law School. I myself did not attend it. A group of female graduates of the Stanford Law School wish to associate with each other to specialize in anti-discrimination litigation with a particular concern to a feminist critique of society. There is no such firm of women only doing business in our community. In order to appeal to what they think is an underrepresented group, women who have been discriminated against, in order to provide for the needs of such women, they wish to create a women-only law firm, and they wish to advertise both when they hire, women only need apply, and when they get the word out into the community that they are around, that this will be a comfortable setting for women to come into. Same or different as the previous case? Well, we're back to intent. This is a favorable, you might say, or a happy use. Or is it? Is it? A guy with liberal, progressive, feminist, there must be some such. But to be serious, a guy with good credentials says, you're doing exactly the kind of law that I want to work on. Why don't you consider me? And if you're worried that I don't know how to conduct myself properly in an interview with a client, put me on for 6 months and watch me. And see whether a guy can deal with these kinds of problems as an attorney. But any profession, a bank or whatever. Is it like assaulting the guy with a baseball bat when you say to him, also a graduate of a Stanford Law School, you cannot apply for this job? Does it matter that, and it is true, historically, women have been excluded from upper-level positions in the law? Indeed, there is a very famous, often quoted case in the United States Supreme Court in the 19th century, about 1875, as to why a woman cannot become an attorney at all, because at that time she had no legal existence independent of her father or of her husband under the common law. Does it matter that on intent, does it matter that there is what some would call a benign purpose to the group of women who say we wish to deal with women's issues from a shared feminist perspective, and we wish to advertise so that women will know that can it be done? And what is your thinking, incidentally, on blacks on exactly the same issue? 3, McSteinberg's hamburger joint. I invented that in a teaching situation that is totally unrelated to anybody's arches. McSteinberg's hamburger joint, a leading national chain, has done extensive market research as to the preferences of its customers. It then announces that it will hire only women to serve as servers in restaurants. They will then be called waitresses. And based on customer preference, they will all be required to wear miniskirts. The slogan of one of the actual hamburger joints, and I don't mean to imply anything about their hiring, I know nothing about it, do it your way? Yes? Have it your way? Do it your way? At whichever one it is. If you won't help me, I don't know. Frank Sinatra, he did it my way. That is the principled liberal position of autonomy. You want to have your hamburger with tomato? Very nice. You want to have your hamburger with cheese? Very nice. You want to have it on a sesame seed roll? Very nice. You want to have it with a plastic spoon or a sterling spoon? Very nice. However you want to do it, you want to do it. You want to have it served by a woman under a certain age with a certain waist and wearing a miniskirt. Debasing to the women. Who are you to say debasing to the women? They like it. How do you know they like it? They take the jobs. That's even more debasing. They sell out because in our society they're stuck. Does it matter whether some number of women actually enjoy that kind of a role? They have a what Marx would call a false consciousness. That means they disagree with us. Or it means systematically they have been taught that the woman's role is to be the domestic server and servile and servant, and certainly never to be the bishop, and certainly never to be the governor, and certainly never to be the chairperson of the bank board of directors, and certainly not to be even the manager of McSteinberg's if men are hired. Not to. Do you have a sense of a correct role such that you would say to your neighbor or daughter or granddaughter, don't take that job because it debases women? And you would say to your city council person, don't allow that, or perhaps you would pick it yourself, not your city council person. Don't allow McSteinberg's to treat women as objects and as subject to looking at their behinds and stuff like that. Does it matter whether the women agree or whether the women don't agree? There is a discussion that we did not have in about the second or third seminar together of a feminist critique of obscenity and of pornography. Just taking you back a moment into that discussion, We talked about the standard kind of Mill-Meiklejohn arguments for freedom of speech and freedom of press, and we talked about from a liberal perspective, and we talked about what might justify limiting freedom of speech or of press, and we had things like a clear and present danger, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, and stuff like that. The exact equivalent to those cases with respect to what we're talking about now would be something like, can you show that there is a correlation, a causal relationship between certain pornography and the abuse of women? Can you show that guys who read these dirty books then go out and commit rape or mug women or slap around their wives or girlfriends or neighbors or whatever? That would be the standard liberal kind of an approach. If you really could show that, and if you really believe that, then you might be prepared to outlaw the pornography or otherwise limit it or something like that. There is an additional different argument which has been made in practice in this country within the last 10 years, which says things like pornography, the centerfold of whichever magazine they're talking about, girly magazines. Pornography is not to be considered particularly as offensive only because it leads those who read it to go out and slap women or commit violence or rape. It debases the status of women in society as a whole. To put it the way some commentator put it, not me, what's objectionable in Tarzan Jane movies is not that Jane does or does not have modest clothing on when he comes swinging through the trees to get her. It's the me Tarzan, you Jane stuff. And I can pick you up like a piece of skin and throw you down like a piece of skin. It's the notion that the society will not take seriously a woman as a bank vice president, head of a mortgage department, senator from, governor from, chief of neurosurgery at. The society will not take seriously, so the argument goes, the women in high power intense roles, high paying roles, if in fact part of the literature in that society treats women as sexual stereotypes and objects. I don't give you that argument as one that I necessarily agree with. I think it's worthy of thinking about and worthy of attention. Is the McSteinbergs, we only hire women and they have to be young, sexy-looking women and they have to wear tight clothing and stuff like that. Not that it's going to encourage assault in their restaurant or even thereafter, but is it debasing of the status of women in general in our society for them to do that? And is that a fact question? It is debasing. We will get Brown University to run a debasing test. I mean, how would one know? And even if one knew, is that a reason to censor? Is that enough of a reason to censor or not enough of a reason to censor? And are we now back notice into something for the greater good of the greater society? Women as a whole will be better off. All of us who interrelate, whether guys or women, will be better off with positive role models. But what happens if there is one group of women who say, look, these women lawyers from Stanford want to go out and run their clinic, legal clinic particularly, for more power to them. We'll make more money because we're going to run a bunny club or whatever it is that one runs to make. How to think about that? How to think about, you may not do that, sister woman, because it debases all the rest of us. Us. Not without its complications, as I expect. D. The XYZ Automobile Corporation refuses to hire women as mechanics. The president of XYZ says, look around. Anyone with eyes can see. Women are adapted to secretarial work and men are adapted to mechanics. And if you don't believe it, go look in a society. Go look in every society and you will see that. Nurture versus nature. If it is true that at a particular point in time, our time or 50 years from now or 50 years ago, if it is true that women, in fact, do not function as mechanics, one can count that, vestiges of a previous or then evidence of a contemporary intentional discrimination against women. What's the name of the record that has on it, William Wants a Doll? Thank you. Free to be you and me. What, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago? 15, 20 years ago? Is that a children's record? But Carol Channing, but I don't think that was her song. Marlo Thomas. I hope we don't have lawsuits by using these people's names. But We, buy your granddaughter, the message was, a tool set for Christmas, and buy your grandson a doll, not an elephant, a doll. And the theory of the record, on that song at least, is that William needs to be taught that fine, virile, potent, upstanding, dignified men can cry. It's okay to be emotional. And they can have dolls, and they can play with dolls, and it's fun to be a daddy. And as opposed to, you're going to watch the World Series even if it kills you, kid. Stereotypes are perpetuated. Stereotypes are perpetuated. Sometimes we know we are doing that when we respond. What are our obligations? What are not our obligations? To change those stereotypes. Should a school system begin using the record, William wants a doll? You figure out for yourself. Those of you who perhaps teach in these areas will have some sense about when kids are sensitive and sensible to those kinds of things. There are lots of... One looks at a plant and sees that the black persons are all sweepers, and everybody from foreman and above, or even factory worker and above, is white. We know what that means. We means it meant no blacks, it meant no, quote, niggers need apply. And that we find very unsatisfactory, and we do something about it. If we look at the same plant and in small-town USA, and we see that women are secretarial and maybe receptionists, switchboard, maybe salespersons, maybe not, for motorcycles. If they are required to wear belts with studs in them or some kind of thing like that? I got to take on the image, run back into a reputed customer preference. We could say that the exclusion of women from the mechanics jobs is evidence of the discrimination in the society, which has steered women into those roles. Or we could say that there are some inherent characteristics of women which make them happier to be mothers with little kids. I don't say that or not say it. How would the discussion go between the normative, how we want the world to be, and the empirical, how the world at the moment is? A tough issue. And back to the basic notion of liberal individualism, even if it is the case, and I stress if, that somehow one were persuaded that as a group, men are mechanically adept and women are not. Even if there were 5% of the women who were more mechanically adept, would they not be entitled to achieve on their basis? I don't for a minute imply that that's a realistic number. But if there's one woman who wishes to try out to become a mechanic, or a fireman, fireperson, firefighter, a lot of real issues. The language issues are probably, one ought to be a little careful, but not worth getting hung up about. The different salaries for the same work, which is part of the tradition in the United States, is certainly worth indeed getting hung up about. Next number, whatever number I'm up to. The emergency room at small-town city hospital is staffed by what are called residents, young physicians in training. Some of them are men and some of them are women. And they treat emergency patients on a first-come, first-served basis. Some number of the patients who are brought in by ambulance are unwilling to be treated by a physician of the opposite gender. Certainly not with respect to examinations of what are loosely called private parts of the body. The patient comes in and she says, I want a woman doctor. The guy comes in and he says, I want a male doctor. One response would be, of all the times that people are vulnerable, he's lying or she's lying on a stretcher, and she's going to be examined after an automobile accident, and she's very upset that she's going to be examined naked in the presence of men, or the other way with women. Of all the times to respect people's preferences, you might say, this is it. Or you might say, who's he kidding? It's only going to be the women doctors that they don't want. The women doctors who go through the embarrassment through 4 years of training of being taken as nurses or orderlies when they walk into patient rooms, even though they're MD docs with good experience. There's your case. The emergency room has some number of women on the staff, some number of guys on the staff. They have a rotation, first come, first served. How many think a patient in an emergency room should be entitled to ask for a different doctor because of gender? Raise your hand. How many? something one would try to accommodate if managerially possible? Is it a decent thing he is asking for? Yes or no? And if in fact it turned out, as it might well in fact turn out, that overwhelmingly it was the women doctors who were not getting assigned to cases, you're back to the first one that you wouldn't let me get away with, remember? Reputed customer preference? Maybe the response that the chief of medicine should give is, every single doctor on this staff has our highest confidence, and this is not a dating game, this is medical treatment, and one in medicine exposes many things to a physician that one wouldn't want to expose to the normal public, including a lot of discussion, and you get the next doctor on the list or find somebody else's hospital to patronize. A hero or a jerk? You got to stabilize the patient in the emergency room, I understand that, but beyond that, there's a temptation in this room, he said, without getting too careful about polling the class, there's a temptation in this room to say, you know, it's sort of legitimate. Suppose there are 2 black doctors in the service also, and the patient says, I don't want a black doctor. What do you want the chief of medicine or the director of the emergency room to say? One view is they should tell him, go to hell. This is a good doctor, and just because you're a bigoted stinker, we're not going to change the system for you. This is a good doctor. That's all you're entitled to. If I'm going to talk to him about my prior sex life, I have to be comfortable with him. If I'm going to talk to him about where I got hit in the car under my underwear, I have to feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable talking to black doctors. That's your problem, or is it? Or is it? I spent some time in Oxford. It was a privilege to be there. In the Oxford hospitals, there is a substantial Pakistani/Bangladeshi population of Muslim women who dress in a very what I understand to be a very traditional way. They wear their heads covered at all times. They wear very long sleeves. They wear very long skirts. They understand that, I gather, to be part of their religious modesty. And they do not want to be treated by male physicians. I asked the question to my British hosts about what you do, hot off of discussions in medical schools in America on such issues, and they looked at me as if I were a jerk, and they said, you bend over backwards to respect the preferences of these people. All right, that sounds right. I mean, if you can't, you can't. But if you bend over backwards to respect the legitimate right of a woman to have, as a matter of her religious conscience, that she will not disrobe in the presence of a male, even a physician, and to get for her a female physician. What do you do, doctor, director of the emergency room, when her daughter comes in, and her daughter says to you something like, I need to be examined for this and this and this and this, and you know, my mother is of the old-fashioned school, and my mother wouldn't let him, but I want the best doctor. Or she says to you, doctor, emergency room, we in our family, you know, we don't do that. That is, the guy comes into a physician, male comes into examiner. We don't do that. You could say, liberate the young lady from the backward prejudices of her family. You might want to say that there's an obligation in a decent hospital to encourage the elimination of prejudice. Or you might say it's none of your business to mess around with other people's beliefs and consciences. And if she needs penicillin, you give her penicillin. And if the only way she's going to roll up her sleeve to take the shot is to have a female administer the shot, then you reputed customer preferences, perpetuation of stereotypes. Does it matter whether you are sent as a physician to practice, say, in the Peace Corps in Pakistan or Bangladesh or something like that, or if you're in one of 5 or 10 other countries? When they come to our hospital in Rhode Island, they roll up their sleeves or they bend over and take a shot in the butt or whatever has to be done. We don't mess around with these primitive superstitions. We are called ugly Americans. When she comes to our hospital in Providence, Rhode Island and talks about things like that, we say to her, you realize, sister, that you are being exploited by the male patrimony of etc. The integrity of her belief patterns is for her to worry about, and you're there to provide penicillin? Or you tell her, in this hospital, the next doc up in the rotation, the obstetrical doc on rotation today is a guy. Sorry, you don't like it, to find a better... You hear the issues, Relationship, nurture versus nature, she has been brought up in a certain tradition, deeply. Should you challenge that tradition? Should you not challenge that tradition? What does a decent society do if you think that women in that particular tradition in some large group are systematically being exploited? And are you indeed allowed to have a conclusion that your patient is being exploited by the values with which the patient presents? Small town hospital hires nurses, hires pediatricians, hires neurosurgeons. No woman has ever been a neurosurgeon in small town hospital. Some number of women have been pediatricians in small town hospital. Many, typically most nurses in small town hospital are females. Neurosurgeons earn more than nurses and than pediatricians. Pediatricians earn more than nurses. The board of the hospital says we pay people according to the market. If we could get neurosurgeons to work for what nurses work for, we'd be very happy. We work according to the market. Without penetrating eyesight, it occurs to you that the market is systematically paying women's work, nursing, at a lower rate than it is paying men's work, neurosurgery, and that peds is somewhere in the middle. Just the market, one lives with it. Something ought to be done about it. Whose job is it to do the something ought to be done about it? The government regulating the market? The hospital refusing to play in this market? The jargon words are comparable worth. Comparable worth. And they occur in many other cases, but they present in this situation as well. The argument is, if a certain job is underpaid and women are overrepresented in that job, one ought at least look carefully to see the extent to which one could plausibly believe that it is because it is women's work that there is undercompensation. My colleagues in the economics department at Brown University would be apoplectic with the notion of comparable worth. The market defines value. The market, of course, is informed by many other pre-existing conditions, like prejudice, like previous exclusion of women from neurosurgery, like what do you do with the women who want to work part-time and are not interested and stay home with their children? Is that roughly comparable to or roughly not comparable to the Bangladesh woman who wears the very traditional cultural garb? And if neurosurgery is not a constructive path for someone to work on a part-time basis, do we change the way neurosurgery is practiced? Or do we not change the way neurosurgery is practiced? And what happens when some number of the women docs are very comfortable with this distinction, nursing, peds, and neurosurgery, and when some number of them are not comfortable with it at all? Bona fide occupational qualification on each of these. When, if ever, is it legitimate to say for this role, gender is a legitimate consideration, whether it means to hire only a woman or whether it means to hire only a guy to fit that role? And would you want to say that there are no such situations where there is a bona fide occupational qualification for racial distinctions? The last one, which I tell you as an educator troubles me very much and quite seriously and sincerely. What would you do if a group of women in a state which had wonderful state universities which were a bargain because of the low tuition in state, if a group of women approached the governing body of regents of the university and said, we want to have one college campus in the state system that is only for women, sort of like Mount Holyoke, which is private, or like Smith, which is private, or like Barnard. We want to have one state campus where those of us who wish to learn only with other women can apply and still get the benefits of in-state tuition. Most people today don't want that. Very nice. You've got 40,000 students in other campuses integrated by gender. Dear board, very nice. We want to have one place where there will be what we think will be a more nurturing, caring situation, where the president of the student government will by definition be a woman, and the editor of the paper will by definition be a woman, and the people that fight against these views will by definition. We want to have the state provide us an option which, if we were rich, we could exercise by going to Smith or Mount Holyoke or Bennington, I'm not sure anymore, Most people don't want that, but we do. Separate but equal, special for women. I think it's an interesting issue. I think it's an honest issue. I tell you as an experienced classroom teacher that if I run my class in a certain way, I can have 20 minutes of guys waving their hands and no women waving their hands. Could be because guys are genetically hand wavers. Could be because women are intelligent genetically and keep their mouths shut when they don't have anything to say yet, whereas the guys run. Could be, it probably is, that I get a certain kind of a response by the mild, understated way that I teach. I tell you that it is my sustained experience that there are differences between the way some number of women participate in my classes and some number of men. Should I even notice that? Should I put it on the level of the table to discuss? What would happen if such a woman came to me in my office for office hours and we were chatting quite genuinely and she said, this is terrific for most people, it doesn't work for me, I want to be in an all-female learning environment, and let's say I need a state scholarship or I need the state to create one such place so that I can do it for the low tuition that all the people who go to the integrated do. The exact equivalent case for races, you remember the United Negro College Fund. You remember a mind is a terrible thing to lose. You remember that the language now is traditionally black or historically black schools, and the government is going after them to close down or integrate. How much, if any, of the justification, that you might feel for the all-women's college within State University would you allow for an all-black college within State University? To be continued.